Welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lenore Manderson, and I curate the Earth Itself program. I'm not going to say anything really other than to introduce Robert Self, who's chair of the Department of History, and it was Robert's wonderful suggestion to bring Stephen Pyne here for this keynote. And I know that you there's been a buzz of excitement about you coming, Stephen, so this is just fabulous. Robert, I'll let you do the introductions.
Thank you, Lenore. I can't take credit for the idea. It came from environmental historian colleague Nancy Jacobs, so I want to thank Nancy for that. Yes, you can clap. It's a great pleasure, really, a tremendous pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Stephen Pyne. On behalf of the Department of History, I want to welcome you to this lecture as this year's Earth Itself program draws to a close. The Earth Itself series is the remarkable brainchild of Lenore Manderson, Brown's globetrotting, visiting distinguished professor and environmental humanist. And I hope you've been able to enjoy some of the other programming of the last week and a half or so. It's been quite, just like all of the other ones from the previous years, it's been quite extraordinary. And the series, I think, has, among many other things, made plain that the production of knowledge about the environment takes place across the vast span of disciplines, from geophysics and climate science to poetry, theater, anthropology, and of course, history. And I'm particularly excited to be able to make this introduction this afternoon because the department I come from, history, has recently partnered with the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, where we are, on a major initiative in environmental history. And we now have a core of both new and established faculty teaching and researching in this field. And I'm very excited as the chair of history to be part of that, or sort of, from a distance. Among the scholarly pioneers of environmental history, and here's the clever segue, in the early 1980s is our guest, Steve Pyne, one of the first environmental historians I read in my own graduate years. Since the publication of his first book in 1982, Fire in America, Pyne has published an astonishing more than 30 books on the social and environmental history and the management of fire. And at lunch today, he was telling us about a whole series of consultations that he's going to be doing after he leaves here over the weekend and next week. And it's clear that his schedule is filled both with scholarly research, teaching, but also with a kind of constant stream of consulting with state land managers and others who are working with, in various ways, fire. His scholarly publications include a suite of 7 books published from the 1990s through the early 2000s, which together constitute nothing less than a history of fire on Earth. It's certainly no exaggeration to say that he's dedicated his professional life to traveling the world, studying, exploring, and speaking about the human-fire relationship. As he has done so, one of the remarkable attributes is his capacity to write for and speak to multiple kinds of audiences. This is a noble attribute of any scholar, to be sure, but it's particularly laudable in the broadly defined fields of environmental science and environment and society, where translating sometimes highly technical research for broad audiences is so critical to public policy. Pyne writes both highly technical and scholarly works, as well as broadly cast, accessible works that stretch beyond the scholarly academy. His work in documentary films, his public lectures, and as I mentioned, his consulting work also attest to the multiple audiences he seeks to reach. He has done more than perhaps any other scholar to contextualize richly and deeply how human societies across a vast span of time and across the globe have battled with, embraced, socialized, deployed, managed, and ultimately evolved in tandem with this incredible chemical reaction we call fire. Pyne is both a MacArthur Fellow and a former firefighter, a testament, again, to his range and a powerful statement about his passion for the subject. In his day job, he is Regents Professor in the School of Life Sciences at the University of Arizona, where he teaches a wide variety of environmental science and policy courses. His talk this afternoon is entitled Fire, a Biography. The History Department and IBIS and Lenore and the Earth Itself series are delighted to welcome Professor Pyne, and I hope you'll join me in doing so.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming and for the invitation to speak today. When I was 18, a few days after I graduated from high school, I joined a forest fire crew on the North Rim of Grand Canyon. I returned for 15 summers, and in that experience, I became a pyromantic, not a pyromaniac, important distinction. On a fire crew, you quickly learn how fires shape a season, and then how seasons can shape a life. And I wondered if the same might be true for humanity at large. After all, we are a uniquely fire creature on a uniquely fire planet. So eventually, I turned in my Pulaski for a pencil and then a PC and became a scholar on fire. And this afternoon, let me tell you some of the things I've learned as a result. Fire has long been recognized as fundamental to the Earth, part of the ancient four elements, but among those four, fire is the odd one out. Earth, air, and water are all substances, but fire is a reaction. It takes its character from its context. It synthesizes its surroundings. So that makes it a shapeshifter. And this has been true intellectually as well. Where do we put fire? All of the other elements have got academic disciplines, even whole departments devoted to their study. The only fire department on a university campus is the one that sends emergency vehicles when an alarm sounds. So I would put fire here in the living world. Life created the oxygen fire requires. Life created the fuel that it burns. As soon as plants colonized the land, they began to burn. They've been burning ever since. These are samples of fusane, fossil charcoal, now been dated back to the early Devonian, some of it 420 million years old. So fire has been a fundamental constituent of life, terrestrial life on Earth, for as long as it's existed. And recently, people have tried, not me, but scientists better acquainted with this kind of data, have tried to reconstruct that long evolutionary history, where fire would be limited at first by the amount of vegetation available and the character of that vegetation, then perhaps by the ebb and flow of oxygen, and then by climate control. So we move in and out of fire worlds, high fire worlds, low fire worlds. Fire can be lumpy in space and time. And more recently, it's pretty much us who has been controlling the fire scene. So it is distributed unequally. It's patchy. Geographically, it's patchy historically. Some places and times have lots of fire, some places very little. But fire, as fire, has been continuous. So even the chemistry of fire is fundamentally a biochemistry. When it occurs in cells, we call it respiration. When it occurs in the wide world, we call it fire. So these two kinds of combustion, let's call them slow and fast, compete. A nice image that illustrates that. And in fact, putting animals into the scene as, in a sense, competers and shapers of the environment has been fire ecology's three-body problem. It's very difficult. That's very difficult to solve. So the underlying climatic basis for fire is a rhythm of wetting and drying. It has to be wet enough to grow stuff, then dry enough to allow it to burn. So stuff that's always dry, places that are always dry, places that are always wet, no fire. Places that have wetting and drying in various rhythms, establishes a potential rhythm for fire. And then beyond that, you need ignition. And there are lots of, it turns out to be a number of ways to start fires on the planet. Actually, the planet is built to burn. It's pretty fundamental to the living world. But the only thing that accounts for the ubiquity of fire over space and time is lightning. So lightning's lottery, particularly dry lightning, where the lightning occurs without much rain, is a very powerful medium mechanism for fire. And then an astonishing thing happened. A creature arrived who wrested control away from lightning and put it into fire sticks. This is a real phase change, not only for human history, but for the history of fire on the planet, and because fire touches is a catalyst, an ecological catalyst, broad spectrum catalyst for so many things. This is cascaded throughout much of the Earth system. And we got small guts and big heads because we learned to cook food. We went to the top of the food chain because we learned to cook landscapes. And now we've become a geologic force because we've begun to cook the planet. Our power over fire is a very fundamental one to who we are. You know, other animals knock over trees and dig holes in the ground and hunt. We do fire. Fire is really our ecological signature. We are the keystone species for fire on the planet. The focus of social life. Interesting research in recent years has begun to testify to how much cultural transmission occurs over fires, particularly at night. Stories, history, various kinds of lore, even in more complicated, technologically complicated societies, over and over again, you see fire, working fire, ceremonial fires, fires for various purposes at the core of what it means to be human. Fire may very well be our first domestication. Even the terms we use for it, kindling, tending, feeding, suggest that. This is a frontispiece for Vitruvius's volumes on architecture, and he divides the world, in a sense, between the raw and the cooked, as Levi-Strauss might have put it, but here between those who control fire, who are civilized, and those who can't, who are outside the realm. Pyrotechnology, converting those wild flames into something usable, a very powerful form of tool, but also it's, again, a catalyst. Think of how many technologies we have or have had historically that at some point in their chain of being had to have fire. So we not only cook food, we cook sand, we cook rock, we cook metal, we cook wood, distill it, almost a kind of universal, again, broad spectrum kind of technology available to us. Fire became an object and a method of inquiry, certainly the foundation for alchemy and later chemistry. But even Aristotle, fire is the model system for understanding change. If you can't get fire right, you haven't got the rest of it right. And it may very well be our first Faustian bargain. Our environmental power is in many ways a fire power, and that has come with costs as well as assets. I think it's useful to distinguish two broad kinds of human uses of fire. One is very much a kind of physical technology, very amenable to technology, scientific reductionism, break fire down into its components, isolate them, house them, contain them, use them to extract various things. And the other is really a biotechnology. It's more like a domesticated species, like having a sheepdog or a hunting dog or something else that you've trained. Here the power of fire depends on your ability to place it and use it in a setting. And how the strength of fire, the power of fire relies on its ability to propagate. And your ability to control that depends on how you manage it. So they're very different technologies. So fire, again, ever the shapeshifter, takes on different careers. So When I think of Aboriginal fire, what I think of it as the ability to control ignition. Your power over fire, the power of fire relies on your ability to place it and time it in the setting. But not every fire you put down is going to do anything. You put it down in snow, you put it down in stone, put it down in the wrong season, the wrong place, nothing will happen. So the power that fire has depends on its interaction with that environment. And you don't control that environment. You can control your ability to work with that environment to put fire in the landscape. That's a pretty significant power, by the way, because at some point, you know, it's like a software virus. You get fire into this system, you can change that whole ecosystem around. I promise I won't have many graphs. This is it, but people ask about it, and it's become a subject recently in scientific literature. There's no reason to think that our fires and nature's fires do the same thing at the same way and the same time. In fact, I would argue our fires basically compete with nature. They compete temporally, by season, and they compete spatially. So these are some stats from Florida, protected forests in Florida, so they're a restricted environment. And these are the fires, and these are the thunderstorms. So you can see the fires occur at the beginning. So you're not getting, the vegetation is not greened up fully, so the fires are more effective. This is the same area, including anthropogenic fire. Same number of fires. This is the same, the red is the same graph, and two things stand out to me. One is there are a whole lot more human-caused fires than there are natural fires. And this is a protected, these are national forests and parks, so that people are not doing what they would have historically done with fire. So there are a lot more. And the second thing is that they're not occurring at the same time. And people start their burning early as patches dry out, and they continue to burn up until the lightning season. In effect, anything they want protected, they have already done so by their own burning. This is pretty common throughout the world. In effect, they seize control over that environment, to put it in power terms, by preemptively burning, by putting their quasi-tamed fires in before wildfires can appear. And this is recently published just a couple of months ago, looking at the US fire stats. We're along here, the human, the lightning, it's the same story, it's essentially. This is not in Florida. The odd thing here, they've got this crazy spike, the largest single thing. Yeah, that's the 4th of July. So, I'm not making that up. So we think of fireworks, there it is. So a pretty strong cultural signature imposed on it. Well, let's think about it spatially. We were talking at a group at lunch about Alaska a little bit, and the boreal forest provides some really nice examples of this. So here's a lightning fire. In Alaska, a few strays, the Alaska Range and the Kenai and up in the North Slope, but pretty much confined to the valley of the Yukon. If you look at human-caused fires, there's nothing to do with that. This is pretty much a map of towns, villages, and roads. So these two are going to interact. So not only in time, but they're going to create, people are going to create a matrix. And where people have denser habitations, that matrix could be very intricate and indeed overwhelm the system. So I think of these as lines of fire and fields of fire. The lines of fire, mostly where people go and travel and carry fire with them, which we inevitably do, deliberately or accidentally. And fields of fire, places where we want to extract something out of that landscape, some place, and we want to burn it for hunting, for foraging, for agriculture, or whatever. So if your firepower is limited by what nature presents, the obvious solution then is to start changing that fire environment. So you begin manipulating the vegetation. And for me, this becomes a working definition of agriculture. You drain it, you cut it and dry it, you drain organic soils, you create other landscapes that would not have burned under natural conditions, but can burn now. They can burn out of season. You've expanded the season, places that couldn't have burned can now burn. This is a great image. This is about the size of the original, by the way. It hangs over the entry door of the Athenaeum in Helsinki National Art Museum. It shows a great slash and burn. Slash and burn for me is not a derogatory term, by the way. In Finland, which has a great record of it. And the reason the young girl is sad is that this is a social commentary. This is a class of migrant workers. They don't own the land. They just go around burning the land for the big landowners. So this is part of that management system. And again, the best illustrations I know are from Europe, various kinds. So I'll give you some examples from a part of the world, particularly temperate Europe. Central Europe does not have a natural basis for fire. It's part of a very small suite of places that which fire only exists because people have put it in there. One of the other places is New England. And it turns out that these turned out to be very powerful places when we think of expansion of European influence, colonialism, spread of industrialization, spread of modern science. These were taken as normative when in fact they are the real outliers and the squirrely places on the planet. Nonetheless, here we can see lots of illustrations of various kinds of fire going on. I particularly like this one in organic soils. This is on the German-Denmark border. And it was called paring and burning was the English, which is basically slash and burn, or denshiring for Devonshiring, which was where a lot of this was developed. And this was fundamental to the agricultural revolution that preceded the industrial. And here we have black forest in Germany. They're burning basically fallow, some of it long fallow. It was an agroforestry system. About 70% of the black forest in 1870 was being slashed and burned in this system. Very high percentages that have been forgotten. And I suggest this might be an explanation for fallowing, a practice that European agronomy has condemned for at least a couple thousand years. So not only are we not putting that land into productive use, but you're burning it off at the end of it. Well, I suggest maybe you could pick up the other end of that stick. It wasn't burned to get rid of the waste that was grown in order to burn it. And in an agricultural system, if you want the ecological effects of fire at some point, in effect, restarting the slash and burn regimen, you have got fuel, you need fuel, and the way you're going to get it is to grow it. And leaving the field as fallow would create that. And there are all these accounts, which otherwise are completely mysterious, about people going into the forest and bringing in branches and pine needles. I found in Ireland they actually dragged seaweed out, dried it out, and dragged it over the field, going to a great labor to increase the amount of stuff burning, which makes no sense if all you're doing is just burning it to get rid of the stuff. It makes a lot of sense if you need the ecological effect of fire, that jolt to start the rotation over again. Well, there are still limits to doing this. You know, you reduce the cycle, you expand the range, you try to coax or coerce too much out of nature and the system begins degrading, winds down. So if you want more firepower, and it seems we always do, you're going to have to find something else to burn. And we did. In effect, we started burning lithic landscapes or fossil fuels, or what in some ways I think of at times as a fossil fallow. So the Earth's keystone species for fire changes its combustion practices. This is going to ramify through all kinds of systems. And I don't think we should dismiss sort of the power story here. Matthew Boulton, partner of James Watt in early steam engines, which were also called fire engines, by the way, which is because that's what they were. So I shall here, sir, what all the world decides to have, power. And in fact, many of the early engines, including Newcomen's, were used to drain mines so that you could mine more coal. So there's this sort of positive feedback loop into the system. And these two fires are going to cross. I like this Currier and Ives. We've got a locomotive, okay, a nice steam engine powered by, undoubtedly by fossil fuel, dividing the landscape. In one landscape, we still have open flames, bison, sort of a quasi-natural world, and the other is unburned. And the fly, I also like this. I'm reading too much into this. Okay, great, but let me, give me a little space here. So the flames are going from left to right. That's one world, but the future is going from right to left. And this, in a sense, in a sort of visual metaphor, is what's going to happen. So I think of this transition, I call it the Pyrrhic transition by analogy to the demographic transition, because population of fires explodes. Huge eruption in the numbers and character of fire. And then after the new order establishes itself, that population collapses. It's below replacement value. And so suddenly we've got an ecological famine. We're not getting enough fire to do the work that the natural world expects. So how do we do it? One is by substituting pyrotechnologies. We find instead of burning the fields, we'll run tractors over it, we'll produce chemicals, we'll find other ways to do it. Another is by actively suppressing what fires do occur. You notice that almost all the devices we have for doing that are themselves powered by fire engines, the new fossil fuel powered. And then it changes land use, how we live on the land, what we consider resources, where we go, how we live. So we're able to put houses in what had been formerly rural areas and now become vulnerable to fire. And we're able to create very large nature reserves, which is something industrial societies like to do, which then become habitats for fire. So we change the way fire is going to appear on the land, and there are lots of examples of that. So let me just use this room, which I haven't had a chance to scout out as thoroughly as I should, so I hope I'm not wrong here. But let me use the room as an example of what happens in this particular built environment by analogy to a wider one. The chairs you're sitting in, I'm sure that the material on the seat has all been tested for flammability. It's equipped with smoke detectors. I'm sure there are automatic sprinklers that would come on. The size of the room, the capacity of the room, the design of entry and egress is all going to be determined by fire considerations. There are exit signs with their own special power sources. So in a way, it's not the only consideration, but a fundamental consideration in the design of this room right now is fire, with the understanding that there's never going to be a fire here. Now, a century ago, probably a little earlier than that, this building would be filled with working fires. It would be heated with fires. Cooking would take place over fires, would be illuminated by fires. All those fires are gone. They've all been put into machinery, taken off site, they're gone. And in a sense, out of sight, out of mind. So there is also at the same time a kind of intellectual Pyrrhic transition where fire as an informing principle of the world disappears. Even in the mid-19th century, Michael Faraday offered a series of public lectures where he says, you know, he's going to use a candle to illustrate what modern science knows about the world. We're back with fire as a model system. After that, pretty much gone. Fire disappears as its own sort of epistemological or ontological presence, and it becomes a subset of more foundational disciplines. It becomes a subset of oxidation chemistry. Heat becomes a part of thermodynamics. Light becomes a part of electromagnetism. All these things that had been integrated by fire, and fire is an integrating presence of itself, all go away. Well, the one place that really doesn't allow fire to disappear during this transition is landscapes. Because not only are we going through this industrial transition, but many parts of the world, like the US, are still actively colonizing new lands. And these are a mess. Large, often abusive burns accompany sort of the global migration of logging companies and other practices. My favorite here is coastal redwoods in California converted to dairy farms. So the United States at this time was pretty much the Brazil or Indonesia of its day, and was subject to international condemnation for its fire practices. Our first professional forester, who came from Prussia, Bernard Furneaux, dismissed the whole American fire scene as one of bad habits and loose morals. He said, you know, a civilized country would never tolerate this kind of thing. This is just sort of adolescence, and the country will eventually grow out of it. So there were strong reactions both for that, but also out of a sense of conservation, in the sense that we need to provide something for the future, that these provided a background to state-sponsored conservation. Something is going to have to intervene to stop this kind of wreckage. And the only institutions large enough would be the state. So the state began creating reserves to protect them from fire and axe, as the saying went. These are all from around the lake states. And there's the sand from Sand County, Wisconsin, burned down again. Think of sort of Amazonia or parts of Indonesia converted to palm oil plantations. So the state would intervene. This was a global project, and it occurred in the northern Rockies as well as central provinces of India. All of the imperial powers extended it. It was easier to apply this overseas than internally. The US was odd because we still had so much sort of unsettled land to cope with. And the task was given to forestry. Who is going to be responsible for fire? There's no academic field that claims it now. Foresters inherited the task because they were given responsibility for these lands. These lands are being overrun by fires, good and bad. And so they become, in a sense, the oracle, the scientific research arm, and the engineer for dealing with fire. Totally unequipped to deal with it. They have no background in Franco-German forest tradition to deal with fire. They don't even consider it a part of the field. Fire control is something you have to do before you can begin forestry. So there is no basis really for methodically understanding it. It was simply seen as a problem with social control and establishing a new order. So 1878, British India. British India is the model for this. The first forest conference I know of, we have so many recent decades. The first one I know of, part of the new order, British India New Forest Law conference brought everybody together. The first question posed to the group was, is fire control possible? And if possible, is it desirable? Those are still the questions we're asking today. There it was, right at the beginning. And right at the beginning, the split. All the people out in the field who are actually having to deal with this said, this is crazy. You're never going to eliminate fire, and why would you want to? But all of the academics, the administrators, the policing arm of the state all said, we have to do that. This is part of modernity. This is part of our justification for rationalizing Indian forestry and the rest. So they do it, the Dutch do it, the French do it, and in time, Americans will do it, and Canadians and Australians. Well, one of the sad things is that even though they were not equipped, forestry spoke with the authority of science and used that, in a sense, to repudiate any kind of traditional or indigenous law about fire. It was all dismissed as superstition. Any of you are fans of Kipling, you may have wondered what happens to Mowgli after he goes to the man village and grows up. Well, he did write a short story that explains that. Mowgli joins the Indian Forest Service and becomes a forest guard. And one of his primary duties is to give warning of jungle fires. And I love that story because it shows the reach of these ideas, what the campaign was. We have to do this to stabilize the climate. We have to protect the species. We have to do all kinds of things. And so it was right at the core. So Dietrich Brandis, the German botanist turned forester, administrative genius, who set up the British system in India. And here this system of reserves that under his guidance and his successors were set up to protect them from fire and axe. There's the American system of reserving public land at the same time for pretty much the same purpose. Gifford Pinchot, our first chief forester, studied under Brandis, wrote Brandis that he hoped to achieve in this country something of what Brandis had achieved in India. So this was a large international project. They thought that they were creating a safe space from fire and axe. It turned out that, in fact, because fire was indigenous to many of these landscapes, they created a zone that would not be part of this Pyrrhic transition. It would not be converted. It would stay. So they created, paradoxically, a permanent habitat for fire. And if you look at the major fire powers today, US, Australia, Canada, Russia, so forth, all have extensive wildland fires, in large part because they have extensive wildlands, and that is a part of their historical experience. So fire control became a part of international forestry, and indeed the success of fire control would be a measure of your ability to modernize and rationalize your economy. Well, I think fire in the past decade, maybe less than the past decade, seems to be coming back. And I think the concept of an Anthropocene may be part of it, because so much of what is behind the dislocations caused by the human presence in this period is exactly this. It's our burning of these lithic landscapes, if you will, and the consequent removal of our previous fire practices from other landscapes. So historically, the problem for people had always been to find more stuff to burn. It's been a problem with sources. More stuff to burn and things, ways to do that burning to extract energy. But I think increasingly it's becoming a problem with sinks. We don't know what to do with all the junk that's left over. That's what's gumming up the systems. So I think it's, mega fires have now become sort of the flip side to melting ice. And in the popular imagination, I would argue that, but I see fire at least as coming back as an informing presence. And we've got lots of images now. We can see the world divided pretty much into two parts, two grand combustion realms. And so not all of Europe is burning fossil fuels. France has got a large nuclear energy. There are some hydropower, but most of that is, and most of the civilization that's run there is. Go below sub-Saharan Africa, and you see a very different pattern of burning. Interestingly enough, where you have urban developed clusters, you tend not to have it. You have one or the other. They don't coexist. They don't play well with each other. So where it survives is in nature preserves, and there it has to serve an ecological purpose. So it's more than just climate change, in terms of land use, all kinds of ecological pathologies, and we're beginning to get a number of global themes and metrics. And increasingly, the one thing all of these various groups have in common is that there seems to be a problem with fire. So maybe fire is coming back. Maybe we could rename the Anthropocene as the Pyrocene, with fire as a cause, fire as a consequence, fire as a catalyst. Give you a couple quick examples, others of the division. North Korea is much in the news, so there we are. I'm sure you've seen some of these, the dark side. There it is, North Korea, conspicuous at night by the absence of light. But if you look at the MODIS imagery during the day, hotspots, they're 95% exactly within that same political boundary. So societies on either side have made or are making that transition. North Korea is not. So we often hear in the fire community, fire doesn't respect boundaries. Well, it seems to me it respects the DMZ. So Give you a slightly different version of this, sort of Pyrocene and Pleistocene. You get North Dakota, eastern North Dakota, famous for the prairie potholes, a relic of the last ice sheets. And famous for its, as a flyway for migratory waterfowl and other wildlife, and regularly burned. They don't get as much burning as they want, but it's regularly burned, and this is part of that older world. Go to western North Dakota, over the Bakken Shale, and all these lights are fracking flares. We're into a different realm of fire of considerable scale, and really of different, almost geologic epochs. And in fact, this has gotten so far in some places that people now play videos for Christmas and holidays rather than actually bother. Fireplace, which is probably prohibited anyway for air quality restrictions. So all in all, we've got too much bad fire, too little good fire, and way too much combustion overall. That's our legacy so far. This is a scene from Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, a nature conservancy site in Flint Hills, Oklahoma, famous for its widespread burning and free-ranging bison. But it seems to me this scene is also framed by the pump jack. We have traditionally thought of fire history as a subset of natural history, particularly of climate history. But I think now we may have to invert that. And increasingly, natural history, even climate history, are becoming subsets of fire history. So this may be granting a new intellectual status for fire. We'll see. I wouldn't bet any money on it, but it's an interesting speculation. So how do we think about fire? What is the future going to hold? This is a Biosphere 2, Santa Catalina Mountains to the south, Tucson on the other side of the mountains. There's the Aspen Fire, burned off half the Santa Catalinas. The next year, the Bullock Fire burned off the other half. Biosphere 2, a completely engineered world. Everything is recycled. Everything is sustainable. This is a design that you could, in principle, plop down on Mars. It has no place, zero, nada, for fire. They reckon if a fire started, they have 8 minutes of oxygen. So you could go through this system and you would see critical places, in place of fire, break glass. They're not talking about breaking the glass to pull an alarm. They're talking about breaking the glass and getting out. In the background, a full-throated wildfire, doing what it's supposed to do, what is necessary to be done in that environment. So two very different visions of the world and what our relationship to fire might be. And I think these map pretty well to prevailing, what I would consider prevailing popular views of fire. So that wildland fire, famous elk bath photo, I'm sure some of you have seen that from the 2000 fires in the northern Rockies. There's fire, very benevolent presence. Elk just sitting in the river, watching it. Or the Twin Towers burning, a very malevolent use of fire in the built landscape. And what neither has is a middle ground. We have almost no images and almost no narratives that describe us as useful agents shaping that habitat with fire. We either get out, or if we use it badly. So let me wrap up the long history. We have 420 or so million years of natural fire. This is what lightning-caused fire looks like in the US. Happy to say my part of the country is close to the epicenter. And then we have a long period, at least for humanity, of anthropogenic burning. We expand the domain of fire. We recode the pulses and patches for burning. Lightning can take what's left. That's what forest fires looked like for the 1880 census. The darker areas indicate more burning. It doesn't include grasslands or deserts, which occasionally burn, and so forth. A very different map. And Florida is pretty lightly represented here. A century ago, the state forester of Florida announced that 115% of the state had burned over the last year. And the reason why is because a lot of places, most of Florida was just open range ranching, and they would burn it twice. They'd burn it beginning of the wet season, then they go back at the end and try to get another little flush out of it. So think of Brazil. It would be lined very much. You can see even New England got a pretty active fire season. And you can see I'm no graphic artist, but here, trying to think about the industrial fire regime, I wanted to indicate a third dimension, history. The landscape is not flat, it's thick. Because we're taking stuff out of the geologic past, we're burning it, and releasing it into the geologic future. It's a great era for lightning fires, because we've also created lots of nature preserves, even wilderness sites. What is lost, again, is that middle ground of us using fire in the landscape constructively. So this is a map of large fires USGS did, large fire meaning 100 hectares, from 1980, so 100 years later, to 2003, and that's what it looks like. So these maps really don't overlay very easily. And in fact, except for some of the places in the plains, this is pretty much a map of public land, because that's the only place where it's allowed. And then this is how it looks to NASA hotspots. Wow. So what we have is a kind of palimpsest, a historical palimpsest, and the problem for people like me is to find the narrative equivalent of a regression line to draw through those scatter points. So if we think about fire and sustainability, we've got two grand realms of combustion, and three kinds of fire. How do we divide 3 into 2 and have something left over? Because if we fail, we just yield the landscape to feral fire. I don't mean wildfire, I mean feral fire, because much of this fire had previously been quasi-domesticated, quasi-tamed, and is now simply gone wild. So let me end by going back to the foundations, fire in the living world. We have two big narratives for our relationship to fire. One is the Promethean story, and that speaks of fire as a technology. Fire is power. Fire is something abstracted from its setting, perhaps by violence. We need a whole lot less Promethean fire. We need to find substitutes for fire, combustion as a generic source of energy. The other, let's call it, to try to keep some alliteration, let's call it a primeval fire. And this is actually the first image of Australian Aborigines from Cook's first voyage. Families coming back from fishing, and the boy is carrying a fire stick. So here they are, the hottest and driest of all the continents, dribbling embers wherever they go. But if you've been doing this for 40 or 50,000 years, you and the landscape are pretty much in adjustment. It's fine. And how else, if he doesn't play with fire, how's he going to learn to use it? So this is a very different story. It speaks of fire as a companion on our journey. It speaks of us as a kind of steward on behalf of all the rest of the earth and its creatures to try to get fire right. And we need a whole lot more of this kind of fire. So as we head into the future, reminded of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, they shall go out from one fire and another fire shall devour them. Wow, he got it right. There is no fix for fire. We have a relationship with fire, and we have to understand it as such. We can fix some of the technological stuff, but in the larger scheme, it's a relationship, and it is, in a sense, our obligation. This is the one thing we do that no other creature does. You know, if we can't get this right, we might as well resign from the great chain of being. I mean, this is what we're supposed to be doing right. So I think it's, I spend a lot of time with the fire community, and a lot of them believe fixes are possible, although I think a younger generation has decided there isn't any. I heard the chief forester a month ago, the National Academy of Sciences speaking, science supplies the solution. There's some missing science. Tell us what it is and we can solve this problem. And I'm saying, no, it's a political issue. You've misdefined the whole issue. Science is not going to solve it. It's not a scientific question in the end. So with that, as we move into a future that's going to have fire of all kinds, who knows what's going to happen, but I can guarantee you fire will be here even after we're gone. So with that, Robert?
We have time for a few questions. There will be a reception outside after the talk, but I think we have time if you're willing to
Sure.
entertain a few questions.
I hate to keep people away from food, but
There are a couple of microphones. What do you want to go ahead? Let me get you a microphone so that.
Place marker. Thank you, Stephen, for a masterful overview of the one thing that I was hoping you'd get to, because it's always perplexed me, is underground fire.
oh,
So I leave it to you to explain it.
sure. Well, we have lots of fires that burn coal seams underground. Some of these are natural seams that have been exposed. Some of them are mines. Some of those mines have been deliberately burned. And it's almost impossible to put these out. They will burn until there's stuff no longer to burn. I think the most interesting may be in Borneo. Some coal seams were discovered that have been burning for at least 13,000 years. They've been able to date it. So every time we go into this El Nino Southern Oscillation event, and it really turns dry, droughty in that part of the world, these become a kind of pilot flame, and they spread out and burn the existing, the nearby vegetation. That doesn't account for the magnitude of the fires there, but there are that. Yeah, and in a sense, part of what we have been doing is taking fire, out of the ground and then bringing it up to the surface and burning it. And so you set up an interesting feedback. There are all different ways of this, but part of it is that I think it's estimated about 25% of the carbon released is being sequestered into vegetation. So now we have more vegetation ready to burn. So you've really set up, there are lots of ways in which this is becoming a positive feedback loop. I don't know if that's exactly your question, but that's the answer. That's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Maybe I can get my voice to carry it. Now that our technology has advanced over these thousands of years, that fire has been kind of our domesticated servant, and we've created technologies like the plasma cutter that burn us hot of the sun, have we elevated fire above what it was before, or are we really kind of deluding ourselves over how much power we have over it? I'm thinking of it in contrast to the biodome you showed, where fire is completely absent, and yet fire was the primary facilitator for developing such a high level of technologies.
Well, that depends. These are very much cultural issues. Go to fire conferences where Europeans and Americans or North Americans are together, and they tend to talk past each other. In the European vision, fire is a social issue. And the way to resolve fire problems is to impose their social model over it. And fire is just a tool. We'll find a better tool. And fire can go away. And in fact, that way you wouldn't have smoke. Smoke is becoming a huge issue and a public health issue now. So everywhere you turn, it's getting harder and harder to put fire back in, even for whatever the purpose is. Interestingly enough, the Endangered Species Act has become a useful leverage in the Southeast for getting a lot of burning done. So that vision is that fire goes away. The American vision is that we don't want fire to go away because it's natural. And our ideal world is a kind of wilderness where people are removed and fire can perform its magic on its own. So think back to the elk bath image. So at that point, they want people to get out of the way and let fire restore itself. So two totally different views of what the fire problem is, how to understand fire. There's a very strong tradition in Europe, which makes sense if you're thinking about European context and fire, that fire is simply a social construct. It's a technology. We can find other technologies that would be better. Take fire out and we'll all be happier for it. On the other hand, the best heathland in Northern Europe are on artillery sites because they're constantly being burned. And there's one in Netherlands that's been, it's been a military site, training site since 1870, I think. So it has been constantly burned, and it's probably the premier heath. In fact, they're starting to bring Scottish cattle in as a kind of substitute for oryx and other things now that they've got it. And the best tallgrass prairie in the U.S. is at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, because again, it's an artillery training range, and it's just burned year-round. Whenever it can burn, it's burned. So neither of those two views, by the way, solves the problem. I mean, really addresses the complexity of the issue. It's our interaction. It's not just one or the other. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, I was struck that with the exception of this last image, there were no volcanic. You didn't talk a lot about volcanism, so I wondered about that kind of fire. And the other question is a larger one, and you alluded to it at the end of your talk, but do you hold out any hope for us developing a more productive relationship with fires?
Volcanoes do start fires, and they also, when they're erupting or putting out, a plume, they can also create electrical storms, which can start fires. So there's lots of evidence of volcanoes starting fires. The problem is it's hard to imagine that as a consistent ecological source, because if in fact they're in eruption, whatever is burned is going to be overrun with lava or ash anyway. So it's hard to imagine that going anywhere. It's just a localized quirk. There are some evidences of spontaneous combustion in caves and other odd things, but it doesn't add up to anything. Is there hope? Well, you have to have hope or you quit. I think we seem to be working, and despite the current political situation, we seem to be working at getting fossil fuels under control at some point, finding surrogates for that, keeping that where we really need it. So that's hopeful. Whether we can put fire back in the landscape on the scale it's required, I don't know. That's going to depend on a lot of social considerations. And in a sense, to use an overword term, the narrative we tell about it. And people are fine to have wildfires burning in the middle of Alaska, but they don't want it in their backyard any more than they want grizzly bears in their backyard. So the more we continue to sort of recolonize what had been rural America with ex-urban and suburban sprawl, each of those creates a kind of protectorate around it, both for air quality, smoke, and for flame. And it shrinks, it fragments the landscape. So fire, which has to move, basically, has less range to do its ecological work. So you need a very strong ecological argument to put fire back in, and we have some. And some of the endangered species and others, but well, that depends on an act of Congress which can be removed. So if that were taken off, I don't know what would happen. But if we don't address it, if we don't find some constructive way to put fire in that landscape, the game is over. We're just going to be playing whack-a-mole with fire, and we're going to lose. We're going to spend a lot of money. We're going to lose a lot of lives. We're going to lose a lot of homes. We're going to trash a lot of landscapes. We're not going to win. Interestingly enough, talking at a group at lunch, one of the things Western U.S. fire officers have given up the belief that they can get ahead of the problem. And they're trying to go into something called, there's no good term, managed wildfire. They're taking a start from whatever cause, and they're trying to think, how can we use this? We have to protect what we really most value from being burned by this, but we can use this fire to do some of the burning that we need. So they're drawing big boxes, some of them quite extensive. I saw one one operation, San Carlos Agency, Apaches in central Arizona, and they got 2 lightning strikes up to 83,000 acres. They did a lot of work, but they were pushing against the fire here to keep it from going. They're pulling it out here. They're doing a lot of aerial ignition. They just loose-herded that fire, and they got it burned what they wanted. And you know, that's not a rational approach necessarily in the way we would normally think of. We'll plan ahead. We'll decide what the objectives are. We'll write prescriptions. We'll go in. We'll do the burning under control. This is riding the tiger, and I think that's what it is. And if that fails, I don't see any plan B. Game's over. So those kinds of fires are very interesting. They're half suppression, they're half prescribed burn. It's a very interesting mashup.
Steve, I want to ask you, it's not a very interesting and broad conceptual question, but it's a question about one of the slides early on, the one where you showed the contrast between natural burns in Florida and anthropogenic burns. And it had the months of the year, and it had some metric about the intensity or number of acres burned. What's the time period over which that data? Is that a modern?
That's within the last 50 years. I think it's a 20-year period.
Okay.
But then, as I showed, this other one for the whole U.S., which has just been published, which is a massive index, it showed essentially the same graph.
How precise can scientists get with core samples to take something like that back hundreds of years? Is that measurable in that precise a way?
Well, it depends what kind of environment you're in, and they do the same with fire-scarred trees. A lot of trees will be burned at the base, and then they grow over it, and you get a record. You can date to the year. You can actually date to the season. And they're finding, and so that's a lot. You can go back several hundred years for those. The most exotic one, are grass trees in Western Australia, which grow up, and then they burn off at the top, and you can see the same. You get the same record. It's really bizarre, and they show exactly the same thing we do in the Western U.S. So yes, you can. The problem is distinguishing anthropogenic from lightning fires. So if you're in an area with a lot of lightning fire, it would be very hard to say one or the other. What I would look for is a pattern of regularity. Lightning is going to be episodic. It's going to come and go with El Niños, La Niñas. It's going to come and go with different places and timing. It's going to be much more scattered, and human burning is going to be much more regular. So I would look for that as a signature. And we have Europe, particularly the Finns, have been really great about this records, and you can just see the coming no fire, the coming of basically Sweden agriculture and pastoral burning, and they've got it all marked in lakes, these annual VARBs, and then it disappears. It all goes down, and then you see a change in the charcoal, and you can identify charcoal soot from industrial combustion. So it's really a 2,000-year record. It's pretty astonishing.
Maybe one last question before we head outside for the reception.
Wanted to throw out one thought that came to me, and I'm sure you thought about it. You portray fire as being unique among the elements, or at least an outlier to. And I wondered if you, in all of your years of dealing with the questions of fire, liken it to anything else in terms of its, because certainly the narrative that you've given us, which is impressive and has, no pun intended, fueled your career, is one that fire is outside of pretty much anything that we can even imagine that we have in terms of its power, potency, as something we have a relationship with. Is there anything else that you think of in terms of whether in the human relationship realm or other kinds of elements that has the kind of transformative power that fire does?
I can't think of any, but I haven't made a systematic study of that. I think what fire most closely resembles, and again, you're talking about sort of overlays, most closely resembles us. And we have, in a sense, become pyrrhic doubles of each other, in a sense, co-evolved. So fire exists in the way it does on the Earth today because of us. Well, it predates us, but we have been very powerful in expanding and redefining fire's realm. On the other hand, we wouldn't be where we are without it. So it's been a kind of co-evolution or codependency, depending on your perspective.
We need this to record for the live streaming, so that's why it's important.
So in terms of defining mankind, so for a long time we looked at tool making as being, and then we know that all these other species make tools. So is the one defining thing that does define mankind is our sense that we can use fire as a tool. Would that be a new definition?
I think it might, except that there were clearly multiple hominins who could use fire at one point. They're all gone. We now have a species monopoly, so it's true for the sapiens eventually, but I think it would be trickier otherwise.
Great. Steve, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. And please join us for a reception.